Welcome, everyone, to the start of a great 2022. I'm Andrea Stumpf, and this is Structure 1515. We are now in Series 2. This is a series about balance. We're going to do 15 minutes of presentation and then 15 minutes or more, depending on how much time you have of conversation. And as usual, I have more to say than the time that I have, so I'm going to fly through this and we'll have time to talk afterwards and circle back. But let me get right on it. So I like to start now by just pointing to my two books, my companion books, the Primer for Partners from a couple of years ago and the Book for Builders from last year. And just to say that if you like what we're doing here, if it's interesting to you, then there's lots more in these books. And I also like to start by framing the exercise. And that is to say that the point of all of this, really the books, the Structure 1515, is to ask and also try to answer the question of where we are in the landscape. And that is the landscape of structuring and designing international partnership programs. The theory, of course, is that if you can see the landscape and if you can see where you are in the landscape, then you have a better sense of the options and hopefully are also able to make some better decisions. So international partnership programs is the modality of focus. That's not to say that I'd say most of what's being presented and discussed today doesn't apply to all sorts of other partnerships, or frankly, if you want to go there, also to life in general. But the specific modality is this kind of hybrid. It's the old and the new. You're in international space, so international partners, and you take a new governing body, really where the partnerships are convening, and you get support from an existing supporting entity. And that's it. That's the definition. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these in the international arena, really a much loved and also very effective modality. And of course, the reality is that these usually need funding. So there's almost always a funding vehicle to go with them, and that's typically an international trust fund. So we very typically in the structure see these three basic components. And in this series, we're looking at how balance plays out in this structure. 2 months ago, we talked about the sweet spot, and last time in December, we talked about creating critical mass. So we started to go into the physics of things. And today, we're going to do some more physics, basically, and look at the center of gravity, locating it and how to work with it. So directly onto the topic, let's go into the center of gravity. So what is this center of gravity? And it's a little ironic because I was really bad at physics in high school and never wanted to see it again. So it's not necessarily anything that I'm good at. So please don't hold me to it. I don't mean it academically. It's really more conceptually by analogy, just to make some points. But the way to think about it is that it's the balancing point where the weight is evenly dispersed. And so, of course, balance, right where that circle is, this was actually an alternate photo for the cover of my book for builders. Right where that balance is where you have that center of gravity. And other ways to think about it is it's the point at which the distribution of weight is equal in all directions. Again, balance. And a way of describing it that I really like, which is that it's a point from which the weight of the system may be considered to act. And I like that way of describing it because it's very action oriented, and that seems to fit very well in the context of these partnership programs. So, taking an action perspective on this, my first example for you is walking the tightrope. I don't know if any of you have tried to walk the tightrope. I have not, but I think we can all intuit that it's really an exercise in balance. And it takes a lot of skill, but come to find out there are also certain techniques that can be helpful. And here's where it's, in fact, very helpful to know about the center of gravity. So did you know you can bend your knees, which helps lower the center of gravity, and that helps you balance on the tightrope. And of course, the center of gravity is right, on a tightrope at least, is right directly above that rope at that one point. So it's really good to find ways to help the balance. Another way that you can improve the balance is by lowering the center of gravity through a pole, particularly if it has a downward curve. So that acts to lower the center of gravity. Now also note that if you put your arms out or if you add this long pole, you have a way to distribute the mass evenly. So this creates more points from which to find that balance. And overall, this even distribution of mass with the bent knees and the pole, all of that gives time and space to make adjustments. So really enhances the balance, the stability within a context of flexibility. So all of those are keywords you've heard me say many times before. And so maybe it's a bit of a reach, but I think we can talk about this in the context of partnership programs. Although before I do, I will just mention that this poor guy was walking backwards, blindfolded, across a very huge gorge, and he did not make it. He fell before getting to the very end, and he fell 200 meters. And incredibly, he must have been caught by bushes or something. He basically got up and walked away. So happy ending, but I do think there must be better ways to do this. So in the context of partnership programs, if you look at the dynamics closely, I think you'll find that we're actually talking about some of our core values or basic values in the context of international partnership programs. And in that sense, you can perhaps think of the center of gravity here, this centered point, as being the core of the partnership program, what holds the partnership program together. And if you add these extended arms or a pole, that to me is a kind of inclusivity, that you're drawing in maybe more buy-in from different stakeholders. And the ability then to distribute the mass is for me a kind of diversity. So you are getting a diversity of views, maybe lessons learned, more experience, or even downstream diversity if you have multiple implementing entities that you're diversifying and able to develop balance through those additional measures. And overall, this concept of having a lowered center of gravity to me speaks of simplicity, that the more complexity you add, the more layers, the more components, the more bells and whistles, that those have the effect of raising the center of gravity in a way that then puts some strain on the ability to balance. And so in my books, I talk about keeping it simple. And I think thinking of it in terms of a lowered center of gravity might be helpful. So of course, this session is called locating the center of gravity. So I did that intentionally because I think where you put the center of gravity does matter. And looking at our base definition here, we had the slide from earlier, the diagram. There are at least 3 obvious places that you could put the center of gravity. And I'll just tick through them one by one. You could put the center of gravity in the governing body. And what you're effectively doing then is that becomes the point around which the partnership revolves, where it draws its strength or its momentum. And that means you're putting the center of gravity in the collective. And that's effectively the power of the partners. Or instead, you could put the center of gravity in the supporting entity. And we've talked in the past, that could mean, for example, in a secretariat, we've talked in the past how the secretariat really is staff. So this is tantamount to putting your center of gravity in staff. And of course, importantly, staff embedded in a specific institution, a specific organization. And we have Jane Kirby-Zaki with us today. So I'm very pleased to also say this is a good place to mention the power of proposal, which is the term that you introduced to us, Jane, in a prior session. Of course, power of proposal meaning project proposals for funding allocations or a draft strategy for the governing body to approve. It's this idea that the source of content can also effectively become a center of gravity, and that this power of proposal plays into having the supporting entity be the center of gravity. Now, our third option here on the screen is, of course, the trust fund. And so it's always a possibility to put the center of gravity in the trust fund. And it's, in fact, something that I talk about that we do too much of. In fact, it's the it's sometimes unfortunate because when there's money, everyone's looking to the money, and it often comes at the cost of really emphasizing partnership aspects. So this, in essence, is the power of the purse. We can also think about, go a step further and think about this a little more legally. So just to point out that these different options, if we think of it in terms of legal entities, also reflect some of these differences here, that the governing body center of gravity is effectively shared among entities. And that's, of course, because the governing body itself is not an entity, it's an informal governing body. And on the other hand, the partners in these international partnership programs tend to be entities, so not individual representation, but institutional capacity. So these entities together are sharing the responsibility or sharing the center of gravity amongst themselves. And that's very different from having the center of gravity in a supporting entity, say the trustee or the secretariat, where it's really centered in one entity, in that supporting entity. Well, because he was saying it too, he's like, I already did something. I was like, oh. All right, somebody is not on mute with a little bit of sound in the background, but okay, thanks. So here's a question for you in this context, and that is, which of these has either a high or a low center of gravity? And again, based on this kind of simplicity concept, I would suggest that the governing body version of this, with the center of gravity in the governing body, actually gives you a pretty high center of gravity, because it takes a lot then to keep and find that core. It's an informal body, and there's more work involved in managing or maintaining that center of gravity. And so next time when we talk about firm foundations, or the time after that when we talk about buttressing, we'll be talking in essence about, in part, about how to manage the governing body type center of gravity. Putting the center of gravity in the supporting entity, by contrast, I think is a way to very effectively lower the center of gravity. It gives you a certain amount of simplicity. You know who's responsible. You've deferred or delegated to the trustee or the secretariat. There's day-to-day availability on the part of staff. So that can be a very effective way to get a pretty clear balance within the partnership, except that the challenge then, of course, is that you may end up doing that at the cost of partnership. So it becomes really important that the supporting entity center of gravity operates not just inward towards itself, but also outward, and keeps the partnership in perspective and manages the balance in that respect. I also don't want to suggest that you can only have one center of gravity. I mean, perhaps you have two. Perhaps you have one in the governing body and one in the supporting entity. But of course, that means you need really clear roles and responsibilities and careful alignment, and that is going to pose other balancing challenges along the way. And just one slide to say quickly, I am focused on structure here, so I'm talking about some structural options for center of gravity, but there's nothing to say that you couldn't make it a substantive focus. And so, for example, you might have a center of gravity in your particular partnership around country voice or country priorities. And I can think of, these major single country trust funds used to have Afghanistan or Iraq or Somalia, or there are some others where that really serves as a center of gravity around which other things are balanced. Or your partnership may be really heavily focused on data and evidence-based results, where that is a focal point, a center of gravity. Or even if it's an incremental approach around pilots and you're really emphasizing the innovation and, of course, the impact that has on the risk profile, all of which is just to say, looking for that point from which the weight of the system is considered to act. Again, the definition that we had early on. And then from there, looking for ways to build the balance. So here's a slide where I summarize some of these things, points I've been making. I don't want to go through this and dwell on it. I think in the interest of time, we can always come back. We can look at these more closely, but it would be mostly repetition at this point. So I'll just close with my partnering to go, which is to give you a quote from my book, that will put a cap on it. It is helpful to locate the partnership program's center of gravity, both to recognize how it shapes the rest and to manage its effects. Shifts in one or the other direction have a tremendous effect on the nature and culture of operations in ways that may be more intrinsic than intentional, but still reflect business decisions or omissions. So a partnership program can be deliberate about its center of gravity. So partners that locate their center of gravity and then build structures and procedures around it are building better balance. All right, that's it. That is my story for today. And we now, I guess the next one is on February 9th in a month. We are now ready for the conversation. Let me stop sharing the screen and bring us back into the group. All right, so again, a lot of physics. I don't know how many of you are into it, and I'm sure I've mangled some things, but maybe it's at least enough to resonate with you in terms of experiences you've had or questions you may have or thoughts you want to share. So floor is open for anyone who would like to pitch in. Thank you. Nicola, you are my volunteer as usual. Thank you.
You know, I always wait to see if someone else wants to come in. It's great. I love the physics analogies. Actually, I think it's a really it's a great image to be able to think about these very tough concepts in a relatively simple way. And what came to my mind as you were going through it, yes, it's a balancing act. And what if there are conflicts? That not everybody in the partnership sees the center of gravity in the same place, and or what if there are shifts? And from my own experience in the program that I was managing, I would say that our supporting entity did a pretty strong shift to say, steering committee, you're the center of gravity. And the steering committee kept looking at the supporting entity and going, wait, weren't you going to be providing lots more support and moral and otherwise? So I'd be interested in your thoughts or the thoughts of anybody else in this on conflicts and shifts, the dynamic nature of the center of gravity over time. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just start off by saying, and then obviously would love others to weigh in. So, I mean, dynamics is really the word, right? And that's why we talk all the time about stability, but also flexibility, and contexts are changing and views are changing and realities are changing. So the politics are changing. So we want these partnership programs to be nimble, but not lose their balance. And so center of gravity is a nice way. And I had another slide, maybe we'll get to it. I didn't want to take too much, or we'll do it in the foundation section to really think about how the shifts and the dynamics, you can either lose your balance or you can keep your balance, and center of gravity plays out in that context. What is interesting, I think, in the context of your comment is at least in my experience, I've seen many partnerships start out being very supporting entity centric. Well, actually, we see both models, right? Let me go the other way. I've seen many start out where the governing body really wanted to be very hands-on and micromanage decision-making. And in a way, it was a trust question. Maybe didn't trust the supporting entity enough to do exactly what they wanted, or there was at least this oversight role that they thought they should be actively playing. And for a year or so, they were really gung-ho and lots of energy in doing that. And then I think that's your example, Nicola, right? Over time, there was maybe people saw that it was working, or they liked the results. They started to feel more comfortable. They got a lot of attention. And more, there was a willingness to kind of pull back, let go, and move that center of gravity from the collective a little more into the supporting entity. And so often I have seen maturing partnerships move from a micromanaged to a more delegated version. But I can see you shaking your head, Nicola. We have just the opposite happening.
Not exactly.
Yes, Henriette, your hand is up. Please.
Just to weigh in. So one thing which you did, a lot depends on personalities. And I find often that the personality of the chair of the governing body, I mean, and the way how the selection of the chair is organized in a fund design, for example, is essential. So because do you have a fixed chair throughout? And do you have the right chair? Or do you have a rotating chair? So basically, officially the chair has all the power, but they rotate every year, so they never learn it. So it's the supporting entity which actually has behind the scenes all the power because they have a chair who always turns around. So I do think that it's about structure, but it's also about people and the politics behind which people to put forward. Let me just as a teaser also to the rest.
Well, and I'll say something about that too, just to anchor it in my books. I have a whole chapter on people, partners and people, partly to acknowledge how important the personalities and the individuals are, both the representatives and the chair, and that we can talk about structure all day long, but often it boils down to who's actually sitting in the seat. And many of
yeah, can I add one sentence?
Sure.
Remember when we were, was it Beirut, I think, the first meeting of the Global Concessional Financing Facility, and the way the chair was elected. And then, yeah, you see all those dynamics playing out at the same time. So, I mean, I don't know if you remember the moment. Anyway.
Yeah, no, why don't you share?
So basically, this is the first steering committee. It's a World Bank, fifth. So the donors sit on, contrary to the UN where I work, there the donors are the ones making up the governing body. Now my words, the supporting entity, the World Bank, has pre-cooked who will be the chair because they've chosen the chair that they want to have. And some other donors, which were the Americans, and some other donors, I know the Germans were furious and voiced it in the meeting. And of course, that never came back in the minutes which were circulated afterwards. So it's only if you were there in the room, you would know this. But it's just from me saying like, wow, is this how fifths are set up? This looks so something which in the UN context, you could never have done. You couldn't even make a donor the chair of a steering committee because that violates too many UN rules, Article 100 of the Charter. So it's just, so for me, it's the design of a fund where, in a way, the center of gravity is supposed to be in the governing body, but what happens in reality is something else. My interpretation of events. I may be completely wrong.
I think we can, yeah, sure, and I think we can identify that when we're dealing with fifths, so when we're dealing with these international platforms, and if you go back to the slide that I had where I described the center of gravity from a legal entity perspective, where we have the center of gravity in the governing body, that's typically a fifth type environment, or what the UN MPTFO does, an international platform type environment, where the center of gravity is in the governing body. And especially in those cases, the chair will be really, really important because that's where your center of gravity is, and how that governing body functions or doesn't function, and how it functions in relation to other parts of the partnership program will be absolutely critical. And often it boils down to the individual. And it may be a good reason to rotate so that you don't get stuck with particular individuals, or it may also be a reason to stick with a certain chair. But that is in contrast to the other mighty oak that I have in my books, which is the one-stop shop. And one-stop shop is essentially a full trustee version, kind of package version. And that is where the supporting entity is in, the center of gravity is in the supporting entity. So that slide on legal entities actually shows you those two modalities. And when you have a one-stop shop, the chair is maybe less important in the sense that all your center of gravity is already in the institution. And in those cases, not so familiar to you, Henriette, because that's not what the UN MPTFO typically did, but the IBRD, IDA, World Bank regular trust funds it was understood that the chair would be a World Bank chair, and everything was in the World Bank. So we had that other center of gravity. But in these international platforms, the chair position is really, really important. And you'll see in my book for builders again, where I have the model charter and there is a model clause for the chair position. And so I have several pages where I play out alternative language, different ways of structuring the chair. I talk about the business considerations in this context and questions that partners can ask themselves to think about what is the appropriate chair arrangement for a particular partnership. And depending on your context and your politics, it will, it may look one way in one case and differently in another case. Yeah, definitely. We're helped by having these real life examples that may not actually be in the record, but do a lot to color, especially in the beginning, color how partnerships work. So one of the themes, of course, is the ability to shift or move with the environment. Nicola, you raised it, that these partnerships can shift. And so this center of gravity ties very much into a flexibility question. So if you're walking the tightrope, you can't stay static. The wind is blowing, you're taking step for step. Even if you're not on a tightrope, a partnership program, we have the image of the boat with the waves and the ballast from the critical mass. There's stuff going on internally and externally where you want to continue to catch yourself, to find your ability to manage that. Yeah, Jane, please.
Hi, Andrea. I hope there isn't background noise here, but anyway, let me know if it's too much. I totally agree with your advice that partners should frankly and realistically locate their centers of gravity when they're at the design phase. I think that's a great idea. And Henriette's example, of how things can change, and also Nicola, that's so true. I think that the other big thing here is gravity, in my mind, equals some form of capacity, and that's why I think there's often disappointment when it seems like the World Bank is taking over everything, because sometimes that's like the World Bank's fault, but sometimes it's also the donor's fault. I'm thinking, for example, of a long ago example on fifth trustees, for example, where the original idea was we are a bank. We, get a request to disperse to this entity. We have no responsibility. We're not involved in any grant decisions and so forth. And we don't even see a grant agreement, blah, blah, blah. And so that over time, I can think of a number of programs where, for example, accreditation became a big issue. Well, who are these entities we're transferring money to? And as we all know, there's a huge amount of risk aversion around losing public funds. Do you want to be the donor who recommended a contribution to this fund that then lost money on some corrupt recipient? I'm being super dramatic here, but the idea that there are certain capacities that create this kind of mission creep and increasing gravity of certain partners, because for example, how do you accredit what's a good procedure? I think by now, there's probably the ability in a lot of these fifth secretariats to do the accreditation work. But initially, I remember the fifth trustee was kind of asked, well, please go out and accredit, the recipients now. And the fifth trustee initial reaction was, of course, 15 years ago, was well, we don't have anything to say about that. So we can give you some good principles and then you implement them. And it kind of went back and forth. So I do think that this capacity issue matters a lot, and it can be not only technical skills, it can also be the legal entity issue. Well, and for the World Bank, I think there have been some uncomfortable situations where the World Bank was contracting everything. What are these partnerships about webs of contracts, and then was told, well, you're not in charge, you have nothing to say here, so go away. So, I think that sometimes these capacity issues can lead to either dashed expectations or conflicts, or, certainly people who were told in the steering committee, for example, you're in charge, you're the center of gravity here, and then they don't have the capacity to implement what they want. and the entity that does is a little bit, has a different view, that can lead to these types of conflicts and issues.
Actually, Jane, that's terrific because you're taking the conversation into a direction that I didn't cover, but is really helpful. And I would say it's not even just a matter of capacity, like what you're able to do, but I think it's even more nuanced because it's what you're willing to do, which is to say that it's a question of capacity, but first and foremost, a question of roles and responsibilities. I think we can say that there are no preset allocations of roles and responsibilities in these partnership programs. We have a kind of obvious sense of what a trustee would do and what a secretariat would do and what the governing body would do. But at the end of the day, it's really what the partners decide. It's not, there's no domestic statutory corporate set of rules that we have to follow. It is an as negotiated environment. And that has all the beauty of being, giving the partners the flexibility to do what they want, but it also has all the challenge of the partners having to figure out what they want, and not just figure it out, but be clear about it, have a common set of expectations about it. So Jane, what you're saying, that maybe in the beginning somebody thought one partner would be doing it, but it turns out that the other partner didn't want to do it, so there may be these misunderstandings that ideally are avoided from the start with clear expectations as to who's responsible for what, who's on what base. And for the trustee, for example, that everyone's clear, what's the scope of that fiduciary responsibility? Is it a limited trustee? Is it a full trustee? If it's one or the other, what are the specific elements that trustee is responsible for? And that kind of clarity, again, it takes some vocabulary. I also think it takes putting it in writing so partners can converge around a clear common articulation. That's where the charter comes in and why I spend so much of my time in the second book on that topic. And then, of course, in the context of allocating those roles and responsibilities, you want to be sure that the capacity is there. So not just wishful thinking that we would like the trustee to do all of it, but also, did we give the trustee enough budget to be able to hire the right amount of staff or the right level of expertise? Stephen, you do a lot of work consulting for different partnerships at the World Bank, but do they really have the resources they need? Or, I could say the same to you, Augustina, with the Global Financing Facility. You have millions, even up to billion and beyond funds coming in, but are they actually providing not just the capacity, but the budget resources for the staff to actually implement what the donors are expecting? So many ways we can talk about this, but it's really important to keep in mind that it's an as negotiated environment and that the burden is on the partners to be clear. And it partly starts with identifying the center of gravity. And of course, you want to do that in the context of where the skill set and capacities are, the comparative advantages, and then have that kind of clarity about where not just the center of gravity lies, but who's got what roles and responsibilities and how it relates to the different partners or elements of the partnership.
Just, and it may be a little bit to the side, but what I'm finding, and I'm not looking for an answer, I'm just raising this for conference to discuss later. One of the trust funds I work with, 80 has 27 different windows. The donors have preferenced 80% of the money. They've earmarked it to basically 3 of those 27 activities, but they expect all 27 to be funded from the fund. And so when you talk about, is there enough money to do what's expected, the answer is no. And this is and it's compounded by the last 2 years of the environment we've all had to live in, where the donors have expectations, they're shifting expectations, but still in all, in the fund that I principally work with, 80 They did a little analysis over the holidays. 80% is earmarked. The 3 programs essentially, and everything else is out of the general catch-all and whatever else money they could raise. So I'd like to, at some point, look at the power of the consultative group, which in terms of where the power, where the center of gravity is, it's obviously with the donor committee. Their expectations go beyond what they're funding. And the heads of the group are going to have not had the opportunity to really have face-to-face negotiations with donors. Everything's been virtual, and virtual negotiations are worthless, basically, from my view. You need to sit down in a Capitol with the key people and hash this out. That hasn't happened. Hopefully, in my case, in our case, it will. But when you look at the earmarking by donors, I don't know if that's always the case, that they preference that much of their money. So I just put that out as a real something we're really dealing with. And it's having a bit of it could have a long-term impact on the trust fund that I work with, which ironically is cited as one of the best umbrella trust funds in the bank. So you've got, it's almost like cognitive dissonance. I mean, here you have, this is the greatest trust fund, but it's got constraints. And we haven't had a real serious conversation with donors. I don't know what the experience is with colleagues, but a real serious sit down, let's talk about this. We know one example is the Brits, FCDO, is going through a complete reevaluation of how it funnels its money to programs. They complete change in some focus and direction. Other donors have as well, but extraordinarily difficult doing this virtually. I mean, when you have a donor meeting, we call them consultative group meeting, and it's virtual, it's, you're just not getting the kind of feedback that you want. Anyway, I go on, but my question really goes to what happens when the donors earmark the money to such an to a limited number of programs and to such an extent that you can't fund their expectations. And in our case, what they do try to do is run and get, other resources to help fund those 24 other programs here and there. But still in all, there's a shortfall in funding those expectations. And it's becoming, the pressures are kind of, I think, increasing sorry, we can't meet your expectations because you're not funding them. And they won't increase, and when you go to them and say, do you really want us to continue to do this? The answer is yes. Then please give us the additional resources. The answer is no. Anyway, that's
Thank you.
for a future discussion, but because I know our time is kind of limited.
No, let's at least pick it up somewhat now. I mean, thank you very much. And it's not a point that's isolated to your case. This comes up, I think, in many cases, and also more and more, and definitely needs some very careful managing. The first thing I think we can observe is that adding either earmarking or preferencing, like you're describing, I think raises the center of gravity. So as you move up and create that additional complexity, it is that much more difficult to balance everything out, to find that right place where you're meeting everyone's expectations and the partnership is functioning the way that you would want it to. So we have a case of increased complexity and maybe not fully shared expectations or even awareness. So the first step, of course, is to have done that analysis. And then I would think the second step is to share it very transparently with the partners. It's not something that I would think the supporting entity needs to carry the burden of exclusively. Just because you may be in the implementation seat doesn't mean that it's your problem only. So, pitching it back to the partners and asking the collective, here's what's happening, here's the data, here's the dynamic that you're helping create. How do you want to resolve this? There's finite sums and there's only so much that can be done. And to make it a partnership issue, it's not intuitive in an umbrella context, because the umbrella, the way it's structured at the World Bank, these full trustee, IBRD, IDA trust funds that are actually very bank centric, tends to put the burden on the bank because that's what the bank is asking for. We want this to be bank centric. But this is a perfect example where the bank can't do it alone. It is a partnership with the donors, and it needs to kind of go back to the partnership, to the collective, to say, we're in this situation and how would you like to deal with it? I think this question of, what's the threshold beyond which earmarking, or actually preferencing in the case of umbrellas, because it's not actual financial tracking, it's not legally guaranteed, but donors certainly expect the bank to follow through on it. So this kind of quasi-commitment type of preferencing, when does it get to a point where it's just not workable or unwieldy? And there was a long time when we resisted it quite strongly. And so it was pretty fascinating to me when the umbrella programs, where this new modality was introduced by the bank, that one of the features was to allow preferencing. And there is a document which is pretty fascinating. If anyone can pull it up in the future, you might take a look. That is the guidelines on preferencing for the World Bank. And it has a lot of detail about how far you can go, what's okay, what's not okay, trying to set expectations. But at the end of the day, I don't think it puts caps on it in a way that becomes really manageable for partners. So the Somalia Multi-Partner Fund, for example, told the donors that they could only preference up to 50% of their contribution. That was an as negotiated feature to try to manage that. The CGIAR, I just was helping them with a transition to one CGIAR this past fall, which is continuing into the new year. And a big element of that was trying to manage donors, not just expectations, but even requirements from a budget perspective, in terms of the granularity that lets them either preference or earmark, or in that case, we refer to it as designated funds, that you can designate what activities these funds go to. So they're really, CGR is struggling, is really working hard on having less restricted funding and more unrestricted funding. And how do you get there? Henriette, is your hand, I think it's up again. Would you want to contribute? Thank you.
It's just a question to Stephen, and then maybe also to you and to the others. Because I agree that if there's a lot of earmark, the center of gravity goes up. It's almost like the earmarking becomes the center of gravity, because
Ouch.
that's what you do. You have no decision to take, you just implement earmarking.
There's something to that.
The question to you, Stephen, in your example, does this earmarking undermine the basic logic of your theory of change of what you want to achieve? Or is it actually, you could chop off 20 windows of that umbrella fund without any harm, and the other ones could still function perfectly well?
Yeah,
Because
great question.
like, to what extent is it's a real integrated windows? If you say 28, then they say, well, it looks like a Christmas tree.
Yeah. I'm going to dodge the answer and just say we're in higher management is in the process of answering that question. And I'll give you an answer when they give it to me and we learn it. The program is not Christmas tree. It has a coherent thematic kind of. But as there's been growth in the various sectors, they've had to grow to respond to what's happening out in the real world. And so, I deal in, all aspects of solar or renewables, and that's just growing. And of course, your programs grow. But they're wrestling with that right now. We have new management, and that's the very question they're looking at, is exactly how they either collapse the programs, or the donors go, yes, we want this, and we'll plus you up. The trust fund operates on a business plan. Well, the last business plan was created before the pandemic situation. And so really, it's not even, you've got to go back and redo it based on the fact that it was predicated on a different future. But I'm going to dodge it because I want to be able to give you the answer from management. They're going through the right now. I mean, over the Christmas holiday, that's what a number of managers spent their time doing, is trying to figure this one out going forward.
Comment there.
I'm not sure where they're going to come out. I do know that I haven't found any programs that shouldn't be there. But in terms of what's the ranking of the priorities 1 through 27, that's an interesting. And then do you cut off the last 4? That's the nub of it. And it's that, what happens if program number 26 ranked happens to be number 1 on a donor's list of things they want done, but they won't fund it. Those are the practical negotiation issues that you run into, and that we are running into. And it's not just us. I mean, I do some work with the UN as well, and I'm always looking at what's the center of gravity for some of the funds and activities that the bank is asked to participate in. And it's really interesting. Is it the chief executives board? Is it the secretariat at DESA, or what? Who's really kind of what the problem is, Henry? It's where is this flowing from? And I keep getting notes. Well, I don't want to carry on, but you know what I mean. I just got another document. Well, this is all under the CEB. Thank you very much, Chief Executives Board. However, the Secretariat at DESA is really going to do the work on behalf of, that kind of thing. And then they ask for money or whatever. So it's more than just a problem for the bank, because we are participants in a lot of other of these partnerships that are proving to be rather challenging these days, at least the ones that I work on with the UN particularly. And somewhere in the scripture of the bank, it is, "Thou shalt not participate in any activities that are aspirational or are not focused," or which of course are a lot of the UN-based partnerships are all aspirational. And we have to figure out how to finesse those memberships, which we do, but at some peril, because there are 3 or 4 I can tell you where we have, what's the word they use? Well noted, but we've never voted to participate. We've never voted on it. We well note that this interagency group is existing, but we haven't raised our hand and voted yay or nay, and we haven't, but we're at the table. But we're under real constraints on how we can actually join these other partnerships or initiatives or whatever you want to call it. And that, Andre, is a whole nother issue of how does the bank really have influence and participate without participating? Because there's an expectation at the high level, the president shows up at COP or one of these other sessions and does say positive, yes, we ABC, But the reality as it gets translated down is quite different. I see Nicole bobbing her head, but that's, again, it's these centers of, Henry, the centers of gravity. This has been very interesting, at least for me. I hadn't looked at it that way. I just simply looked at, the person that pays the money, calls the tune. And if the donors want this, then you kind of do what they do. But it's a little more obviously more complicated. But one last point, Andrea.
Yeah, please.
It does explain the power of the desk officer in the ministry of whomever we got the money from. And that's another issue of people, and we talked about it before. Sometimes the real power is a mid-level bureaucrat at the Capitol who really controls the money. And that may be the center of gravity is that desk officer in the Ministry of Development.
For better or for worse, because if you have a good
Exactly.
relationship, you can make it work for you. And if the person then leaves and you lose that relationship, you might have a shifting center of gravity that you have.
No, absolutely. And that was to my point that we haven't had face-to-face contact with these donors. And there have been changes in who is actually the desk officer, particularly in the UK. There have been some changes. Well, if you don't have a relationship with them, the baton does not get completely passed. And at least in our case, nobody's been in a Capitol in 2 years.
Yeah, particularly when it boils down to the individuals, Stephen.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, but what
Absolutely.
I found also interesting about how you responded at the beginning of what you were saying is that senior management was looking into this and you would let us know once they had gotten some clarity. But again, that's an inward looking approach. And it may be very appropriate for umbrellas because those are intended to be supporting entity centric. But it isn't necessarily what I was suggesting, which is that this be transparently opened up within the context of the partnership, meaning also the donor community. So it's not just a matter of senior management huddling together to figure this out.
I didn't, but internally, you better understand what the message is before you sit down with the donors. That was really my point. They're trying to come up with the talking points and the negotiating points when they go and talk to the donors. So they have a very clear,
that's right.
So if they're going to jettison something, they know precisely why they're going to jettison something.
Stephen, I think let's get Paul to weigh in because he has lots of experience and I'm sure something useful to say. Paul, your hand is up.
No, just a very quick observation based on everything we've heard. First of all, I think this concept of the center of gravity is a really, useful kind of mental tool, right? And both to, I can think about it in the bank context, to think of it as another way to kind of explain the distinction between the default approach to fifths and the default approach to trust funds, right? But also within those, within both categories, we can think of examples where the center of gravity is, higher towards the governing body or the donors or lower towards, the bank as the supporting institution, right? And driven by all of the things that people are talking about, right? The personality of individual desk officers or the personality of individual bilateral agencies, right? Or all the rest of it, right? But just one thing that I, was jumping out at me, in the discussion of particular programs, right? I think a big factor in this issue of the center of gravity is what's the story being told to the donor when they join the program? Because I think we have some programs like FIFs that are set up. I don't mean to suggest that when it happens this way, it's perfect. It's not, but it's set up and that's the partnership, right? That group of donors ends up being the group of donors, throughout the life of the partnership, maybe without anybody else, right? And there's a number of FIFs that are like that. You also, but then, on the other extreme, you have, trust fund programs, some of which are very large, right? Where that, there maybe is an initial founding group, but people are coming in and out all the time, right? And if you're telling a different story to every donor that's coming in about what they're going to do, what their money is going to be used for, what their role is going to be, then you're inviting this type of, imbalance, right? And it's natural that it happens for all the reasons we talked about, because they have legislative restrictions, or they say they have these restrictions and whatever, right? And we end up with all these individual cases. Can't we do it differently here because of X, Y, Z? Maybe sometimes you should, sometimes you shouldn't. But that kind of scenario, I think the rolling partnership, right, presents different challenges than the static partnership.
Yeah, and also I think exactly what Stephen was saying a moment ago, which is that it is important for senior management to know what the story is, to really be able to settle on what that narrative is. And that includes, what are we willing and able to do? What are we putting on the table in terms of our role? And that not just goes to the ones that the World Bank is housing, through like the umbrella model, but even what is our participation in some of these looser or more aspirational partnerships? Your other question, Stephen, how do you handle that? It starts with the institutional understanding and hopefully a consistent narrative as to what the partner is willing and able to do, and then not to raise conflicting or mixed expectations that, raise that center of gravity to the point where you're going to tip over. We're back to your conflict point, Nicola, from the beginning. Jane, your hand is up. Yep.
Yeah, just to say, this is a really interesting case, and thank you to Steve and everybody. I wanted to say that these things, when they're like, there's such a huge mismatch between windows and restricted funding and so forth, if it gets built into the results framework, that's another source of tremendous pain, because then if you have, like, for example, set of results indicators for each window, and then you're not really achieving much in the majority of the windows, it starts to look really bad for the whole fund, even though you may be using the money that you do have that is limited to a few windows so well. So that might be another way to approach it with management, to say that the results framework by which, the supporting entity, and that's particularly maybe here the trustee, is going to be judged, it really adds to the urgency of these issues if that is the case. It's another part of the structure that I think that's gotten heavier in recent years, especially in these umbrella funds, but really also in a lot of the funds that have a significant, a lot of the programs that have a significant amount of funds.
Right, and also Jane, ties into the whole preferencing question, because there's the ex ante view that we're going to preference up front, but it's the ex post which is going to validate whether that preferencing actually happened or not. And that's usually in the progress reporting, which is very tied to the results framework. So it's all part of a continuum and related in terms of the life cycle. Folks, we're at the hour. We're actually beyond the hour. So I'm going to propose that we, as wonderful as it would be to just keep going, I think everyone has schedules, especially different time zones, that we end here and we pick up again in a month. And all these topics are very related to each other. And I will start with center of gravity and in the firm foundation context when we pick up again on February 9th. And until then, please, collect your examples and your questions, and we'll keep on going deeper. Thank you very much to everyone. Have a good rest of the month, and great way to start.
Thanks all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you again, Andrea.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.